What's okay in the marriage bed? So we mentioned some things that defile the marriage bed, but now let's look at some things that are honestly, is it okay or is it not okay? Things like oral sex, things like different positions, sex toys. And so here are kind of concerning these things that I want to bring, first of all, like a basic framework of how each couple should decide whether oral sex, sex toys, or different positions are allowed. Because there's really no one way or the other way in the Bible, even though I know some people are like very strong set on against oral sex, or some people are said, you know, hey, it's okay to have oral sex in marriage. Some people are against sex toys, and some people are like, oh, it's okay to have sex toys. And I'm going to touch on each one of them in just a moment. But here are the 3 questions that you should ask before you can determine if this is okay for you or not. The first question you should ask is, the scripture condemns it? Is it prohibited in the scripture? Because if it's not, you can assume it's permitted. The second question that we have to ask, is this beneficial? Is this harming me? Or is this harmful? Or is this helpful? Now, I get these questions from the Apostle Paul's writings. Apostle Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12, he says, all things are lawful to me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful to me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. So the first question is like, is it lawful? Is the Bible against it? If the Bible is silent, okay, maybe it's permitted. Number 2, is this harmful? Is this beneficial? Like, is there physical harm to this activity or not? And is this gonna bring your marriage together, or you're gonna separate after that? Like, you're gonna drift apart. And then third one, and this is the big one, this is the biggest deal breaker for any kind of topic that a lot of couples ask about, you know, concerning different sex acts or positions. Is the other spouse on board with it? Is there mutual consent? Is the spouse forced into what she's not comfortable with? If that's the case, then it's not okay. Even if the Bible is not against it, even if you like, oh, there's no harm in this, but the other spouse is not consenting to it, the other spouse is not comfortable with it, then it's not okay for your marriage. 1 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 5, it says, do not deprive one another except with consent for a time. So if you can't deprive yourself from your spouse without consent, you need consent to explore each other in this particular way that you may have a question with your spouse permission and their consent. And if they're not comfortable, you can't push it. You can't force it. Now, a few thoughts on oral sex. The Bible does not condemn oral sex within marriage. We don't see strong condemnation against it. Outside of marriage, oral sex is still sex and it's sin. And so it's never supposed to be used as an alternative to actually having an intercourse for unmarried couples. Sometimes people are like, yeah, we're just messing around. No, you're committing fornication if you're having oral sex with your girlfriend or with your boyfriend, period. Now, within marriage, oral sex is free from sin as long as there is mutual consent. In fact, some people go as far as to say that there are verses in the Bible that indicate or speak of oral sex in Song of Solomon. In Song of Solomon chapter 2 verse 3, where the fruit represents the male genitals, and in Song of Solomon 4:16, where the garden throughout the book of Song of Solomon is speaking or is used for vagina. And so if you read those verses, you know, you can get pretty much that implication that this is referring to oral sex. But again, each marriage bed is going to be different depending on what each person is comfortable with. When it comes to oral sex, I would really encourage, because usually it's the guys who are like, yeah, I want to do it. I want my wife to do it. But are those desires fueled and created because you watched pornography? Or they're just your godly desires to explore your spouse in an intimate way? And a lot of times in the area of marriage, you know, one of the spouses feels very grossed out by this idea because of the abuse, or because the way they grew up, where the idea of sex in marriage was very gross. And God created sex and He wants us to have joy and enjoy it and have pleasure and explore each other and get to know each other, as long as it's done in a way that does not bring another person into that marriage bed, whether virtually or physically, as long as you're not bringing fantasies also about somebody else onto your spouse, and as long as there's consent to that. And so it will depend on each couple, and it's a liberty that each couple has to exercise. There is really no rule against it or for it when it comes to oral sex. Now, sex toys. And I reached out to our marriage ministry, kind of asked them also advice on this. You know, I think that people don't need sex toys in their marriage bed, but I'm gonna read something that they sent to me. It's a conversation that they had with one person who said this: when you are more focused on the need for a toy versus your mate, it's not a good thing. You can do away with your mate and just rely on the toy. We tell couples not to get involved in this. The same thing as, applies to can people masturbate outside of, marriage. It's something that is wrong, I believe. And so I think that when it comes to this, when it comes to a sex toy, even though the Bible does not explicitly say anything against it or for it, I think that if it replaces your spouse, or if you can no longer satisfy your spouse that you need a toy now, then you really are already kind of adding some foxes in your vineyard, and you should examine, what's happening really with your heart and what's happening with the quality of your marriage. Because sex is not really, it's really like a revealer of what's happening in your marriage. It's not necessarily a deal breaker, like where it makes your marriage, as much as it reveals if your marriage is doing good or is broken. So on my stance on this, I think that couples should abstain from it. Anal sex. I know that in our culture, it's, portrayed now as it's okay, and it's something that people push for and go for, especially because of pornography, that it's been pushed in our culture. Now, I want to mention something about that, what it's not. Some people misuse the scripture in the Old Testament to say that anal sex is bad because of those scriptures. I think anal sex is bad, and I don't think you should practice it, but not because of those scriptures. So medically speaking, anal sex is neither healthy nor safe. Anal sex increases the risk of tissue damage, infection, and transmitted of STDs. And so the more your eyes are pure, the more your heart is pure, the more the pleasure will be pure in your marriage, and you don't need to do anything to add to it